Catholic Church was as strong as the Protestants in denying works procure our salvation. The first canon of the Council of Trent, the very first canon, says anyone who thinks that his works, whether it's by the law or any other work that he thinks can provide salvation, let him be anathema. Okay? So it's crystal clear from Catholic teaching that however Protestants want to say that works can't save us, well, the Catholic Church is even stronger. Okay? So what's the problem then? Well, it depends on how you're looking at works, in what context you're looking at the works. On the one hand, we can say with the Protestants, works can't save us. Okay? And case closed. All right? On another view, the works do save us. They do justify us. And the Bible's crystal clear about that. So how do you look at that? Now, here's the problem that comes to the fore for the Protestant. He will base his view on Romans 3 and Romans 4, basically. And there in verse 28 of Romans 3, Paul says that a man is not justified by the works of the law. Okay? And wow, you take that statement as a face value statement, that's the conclusion you come up with. Man is not justified by works of the law. Okay? But then you got this little problem. And that is in the previous chapter, chapter 2 of Romans, the same Paul says in Romans 2:13 that a man is justified by works. Okay? So now I will grant you that's not easy to deal with. You have the same person saying what appears to be something totally opposite from one chapter to the next. And this has been the cause of controversy. I mean, if I were back in the day of Paul and he asked my advice on how to write these two chapters, I will be a little bit more careful in saying you're justified by works in one chapter, and then in the very next chapter say a man is not justified by works of the law. Unless you're going to do a good job in explaining what the difference is between justified by works in Romans chapter 2 and not justified by works of the law in Romans chapter 3. If Romans chapter 4 come up with a good explanation why those two seem opposite, that would be acceptable. But he really doesn't do that. We're left on our own to figure this out. Okay? And a lot of people have basically reinvented the wheel with every denomination that comes along because of the difficulty of these two chapters. Okay? So let's just take an example. What do most Reformed Protestants do with this seeming dichotomy in Paul's theology? Well, for Romans chapter 2, what they will do is say that this is a hypothetical chapter. Hypothetical. What do they mean by that? What they mean is that if it were possible to be saved by works, then this is what Paul would have written, or this is how he would have said it. Okay? So in other words, all this talk of Paul, because it's not just Romans 2:13. He starts out in Romans 2 verse 4. And he starts talking about how because of the grace of God, we have come to know him. And because we know him, we can either good or bad. And if we do good, we will be rewarded. If we do bad, we will be judged. And here's a chapter where he's basically talking to the Jew who thinks that he is so close to God, and that the Gentile, because he's a pagan, is far from God. And so Paul is challenging them. He's basically saying, okay, you have this law. Do you obey this law? All right, well, let me show you people that do obey it. The very Gentiles that you think are pagans and have nothing to do with God, they obey the law written on their heart. And because of that, God's going to justify them. Whereas you Jews who have the law written on tablets, okay, right in front of your eyes, you don't obey the law. And you're not going to be saved. So it's the very opposite of what you Jews think, you see. But notice that Paul's basing it all on the law, obeying the law. And he says, if you obey the law, you'll be justified, as the Gentiles do. Perfect examples of people who don't have the Mosaic law like you do, and yet obey the law written on their heart. God's going to save them. Now, the Protestant is forced to the position, though, that if this is true, then it can't be by faith alone. Because Paul just said they're justified by works, which already presumes that they believe in God, that they have faith. Okay. So what do you do with this passage? Not much you can do. You either accept it as it is, or you're going to make a new religion. And the new religion says, well, it's not really that way. This is just hypothetical. If it could be this way, well, then we would have this way. We would have justification by works. But since it can't be that way, well, that's the reason Paul goes and writes Romans chapter 3. Because Romans chapter 2 is hypothetical. So we go to Romans chapter 3, and it gives us a whole different scenario, which is you can only be saved by faith alone and not by works. Okay? So they make, in order to prohibit themselves from having Paul contradict themselves, they just say Paul gave us a hypothetical case in Romans 2 and a real case in Romans 3 and 4. Okay? Now, if that's not the most... I want to be kind here, but if that is not the most contradictory theology I have ever heard in my life, and I used to hold it, I don't know what is. Okay? To claim that one part of the Bible is just hypothetical so that you can save your interpretation of the next chapter? Okay, so what's the Catholic solution? The Catholic solution is no, Paul is not contradicting himself between Romans 2 and Romans 3 and 4. They actually coalesce if you look at them correctly. Okay, now how do we do that? One way to do that is to go to how Paul describes the works that don't justify in Romans 4. Romans 4, Paul starts out by giving an example of Abraham and how Abraham believed God and it was counted for him as righteousness. And he quotes Genesis 15:6. And then he goes to David and he talks about David as quoting Psalm 32 and Psalm 51 about David's sins and how he was forgiven. Okay. But right in the middle of that, he uses a very particular word. And he says, if salvation were of works, then it would be of debt. Then it would be a matter of debt. And the Greek word for debt there is ophelimos. Very common word, but it's a word that normally means debt. Someone is in your debt, or you owe something to somebody, or in other words, it's a legal matter. Okay, that's what debt is. It's a legal matter. You have worked for someone. So let's say you put your 40 hours of work in per week. They owe you a legal debt, and there's no way out of that for them. You've put in your work. You've signed a contract. For this much work, I will receive X amount of dollars. That's a debt. He has to pay you. If he doesn't pay you, you take him to a legal court and you sue him, and you get the judge to force him to pay you the money that he owes you. Okay? So there, it's all legal. And what Paul is saying to these Jews is, look, salvation, justification, whatever word you want to use for the time being, is not a matter of debt. It's not a legal issue. It comes purely from the grace of God, from his beneficence, from his generosity, from him going above and beyond what the legal requirements are. That's how you get your salvation. Purely, 100% from God's grace. So you can never come to God and say to God, here's my 40 hours of work that I put in this week. You owe me because I've worked so hard for you. And you know what God's going to say to you? He's going to say, here's the truth. I don't owe you a thing. Okay? The only thing I will give you is what I believe from my beneficence I can give to you. From my loving nature. Okay? That's how you're going to get it. So please don't come to me with your debt list and give me your works and say that I'm obligated to pay you something. Because I'm just going to turn around and say no. Okay? That's what Paul is trying to drum into the mind of the typical Jew of this day, who has grown up with the Mosaic law, who has done this ritual day after day after day, and thinks that because he's a Jew and because he does his rituals, that God is obligated to save him because he's a child of Abraham. He was born into the faith, so to speak. And all he has to do is go through the motions, and basically God owes him because Abraham started it all for him. Okay? And Paul's saying, no. That is the exact opposite of what God's looking for. Granted, you're a child of Abraham, but there was a certain way that you had to grow up as a child of Abraham. And that one way was not assuming that God owed you something because you were a Jew. And you want me to prove it to you? Well, let's look at Abraham. Did Abraham thrust his works in God's face and say, God, you owe me because you chose me? No. Abraham had to believe God under the most extenuating circumstances. Okay? He had to put his trust in God. And once God saw that, then God rewarded him. God didn't pay him anything because he didn't know anything to Abraham. But he rewarded Abraham because Abraham showed that he loved God, that he wanted to be obedient, that he was on God's side, that he had God's vision for the world. And once God sees that, he will reward us graciously, only from his grace, not because he owes us. Okay? So this word debt that Paul is using here in Romans 4 becomes the fulcrum upon which we understand the whole basis for justification. You can't be justified by putting God in debt. Okay? Same with David. That's the next example that he gives. Here's David, who's quoting from Psalm 32, and what's that all about? Well, that's about the time that David committed sin with Bathsheba, committing adultery with her and murdering her husband, Uriah the Hittite. Okay? Now, David could have come to the priest and said, do all these sacrifices for me because, I've sinned against God and these sacrifices will take care of everything, and as if that's all there was to it. No, those sacrifices wouldn't have done a thing for David. Okay? Because David was in what we call in Catholic theology mortal sin, capital sins that he had committed, that he owed his life for. So there was no sacrifices that were going to take care of, no works, in other words, that David could have done to try to cover over these huge sins that he committed. What was the only thing that was going to work? Well, when Nathan came to him and said, "Thou art the man," David said, "Yes, I am the man." And right away, he knew that he was caught. And he pleaded to God for forgiveness. That's what those Psalms are all about. Do not take thy spirit away from me. I am sorry that I've sinned. You could just see him crying on his bed, asking for forgiveness. And that's what God wanted to see. And God forgave him. But more importantly, God justified him. Now, here's the crux. Here's the problem for the Protestant. God justified David after David asked forgiveness for his sins. That's what the whole message is about in Romans 4. That just as Abraham was justified, so David was justified. Just by repenting of his sins. Okay? But here's this just begs the question. If David was justified after he asked forgiveness for his sins, for committing adultery with Bathsheba and murdering her husband, what was David's life before this? Was David a justified man? Well, you know what? If there was anybody who was justified in the Old Testament, it was the young David. I mean, he came before his 7 brothers to Samuel. Samuel passed up the 7 brothers of David and said, "Do you have any more sons, Jesse?" "Well, yeah, there's a young lad out there. Bring him in." So they brought him in, and Samuel says, "Here is the next king of Israel," because God judges men in their hearts and not on the outside. Now, if that's not justified language, I don't know what is. His 7 older brothers were passed up because of the sincerity of David's heart. And then, of course, we read about David taking on Goliath, and we read about David in all his exploits. And God says, "Here's a man after my own heart." He doesn't say that about too many people, but he said it about David. And so you know that David's life prior to his sin with Bathsheba was one of a justified man. But when he sinned with Bathsheba and killed her husband, he committed capital sins and he became an ungodly man. If he were to die that day, he would go straight to hell. Okay? And David knew this. He figured it out after Nathan confronted him. And that's why he asked God for forgiveness. Okay? But here again, just begs the question. If David was justified before, and now that he commits sin with Bathsheba, he loses his justification so that he has to regain it, which is what Paul is teaching in Romans 4, that David is justified when he asks forgiveness for his sins of Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite. Well, this just totally destroys Protestant theology. Why? Well, because Protestant theology, particularly the Reformed version, says that David, if he was justified, can't lose his justification. That nobody can lose their justification. Once they're justified and they receive Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, And that's it. It's over. Can't lose it. But apparently David lost his justification. Otherwise, Paul couldn't use him as an example of someone who's being justified when he asked forgiveness for his sins over Bathsheba. But this agrees exactly with Catholic theology, because Catholic theology says, yes, you can be justified, and then you can lose your justification when you commit mortal sin. And then you're an ungodly man, and you're on your way to hell. And the way you get your justification back is you go to the confessional, and you confess your sins, just like David did on his bed. And God forgives you. Now, it doesn't mean you're not going to be punished temporarily, as David was punished. He lost the son that Bathsheba bore, and David's life was never the same. All his daughters were raped. His wives were raped, okay, by members of his own family. And he was chased from here to there until the end of his life. And he ended his life in misery. Okay? So it doesn't mean you're going to get away with anything. It just means that God's going to forgive your eternal torment for the sins you committed. And by that, he justifies you again, and you are now in a justified state. So if anything, Paul's little pericope there supports Catholic theology. It also tells us what kind of works Paul is against. He's not against works per se, but works in which we try to put God in debt and say, you owe me salvation because of the works I do. I don't care about you or your plan or anything. I just did my work and I want to be paid. That's exactly the kind of person God doesn't want in his kingdom. And that was the typical Jew of that day, you see. And that's why Paul raises this whole fuss in Romans 2 about you Jews, you claim to have the law, but do you obey the law? No. Well, let me show you someone who does obey the law. The Gentiles, who don't have the written law, but they have the law written on their heart. Those God will justify because they obey even the law written on their heart. How fantastic is that? You see? And is it because the Gentile thinks God owes him something? No. It's because he's fearful of God. He knows that those laws are written and that he's required to obey them. And he's responsible to obey them. And he does so just because he knows God's bigger and better than he is. But he doesn't expect to be paid like the Jew does, because the Gentile doesn't have anything from which to be paid from. You didn't grow up in some special place or with some special people. You see? So this is the crux of the whole issue. What kind of works are we talking about? If we're talking about works that someone does to try to get God to pay them, that's anathema, and the Catholic Church agrees. But if we're talking about works that someone does because they love God and they don't expect to be paid from God, but to be blessed by God outside of the legal framework, just because of God's generosity, that's the kind of works that God's looking for, you see. And then we have James chapter 2. And that fits in right with Romans 2 and 3 like a glove. Because now, and James was written before Romans. Now we see that why Paul said what he said. In Romans chapter 2, Paul says, works justify, and we have a pretty good idea what that means. In Romans 3, he says, works of the law don't justify, and now we know why he said that, because of the whole debt issue that the Jews were trying to put God in. And now James comes along and he says, a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. Okay? Because he would figure, yeah, there's going to be some people out there that think that if we say you're not justified by works of the law, that must mean you're justified by faith alone. No, it doesn't mean that. It means you're not justified by the works in which you try to put God in debt. You see, not that works can't justify you, but it's the kind of works you're doing that can't justify you. You see, so you can't conclude from all this that, well, it must be the case that we're justified by faith alone. No, that's not the proper conclusion. Okay, the proper conclusion is, what kind of works are you talking about? That's the way to attack the problem. Okay, so James can say a man is justified by works, just like Paul does in Romans 2:13. There's really no difference between those two. Okay, so now some people try to get out of this by saying, well, Paul doesn't really mean justified there. He just means, that works are the fruit of your salvation. So the better word to use there is vindicated. Well, that's false. And you can tell that just by the grammar of the sentence in James 2:24. He says, a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. So let's put, if justified there means vindicated, let's put that into the sentence. Let's see what it means. See what it says. It would say, a man is vindicated by works and not by faith alone. Does that make any sense? So you do damage, not only to the Bible, but to your own position, to say that justified there means vindicated. Because then it would say, as I just said, a man is vindicated by works and not by faith alone, which means what? That he can be vindicated by faith alone? Well, that can't make any sense, you see. So you can't change the definition of the word dikaio or diokaiosunne in James 2:24. You have to keep it as justified because that's what the context gives you. Okay. So it can say a man is justified by works. How is that? Well, the example it gives there is of Abraham taking his son Isaac up to the altar. Okay. That was not just a result of Abraham's faith. Okay. That was an actual work that he had to do, that God required him to do. Okay. Because some people have this notion that, well, if I have faith, then my works are just automatically going to flow from my faith. False. That's one of the biggest problems with this whole faith alone theology. That if I press the button of faith, and the conveyor belt of works is just automatically going to produce works. No. You have to work at it. That's why it's called works. You've got to add the works to the faith because they don't come automatically. You might have a better disposition to do works. You might have a better inclination, but you actually got to do the work, you see, and that's where the rubber meets the road. We can talk about all our desire to do the works, and those works include being obedient to the law of God. Do not commit adultery, do not kill, do not steal, all those things. Do not look at pornography, do not engage in, sexual activity outside of marriage, things like that. Yeah. They're all required every day. And sometimes they're hard to do because of the proclivity to sin that we each have after original sin. And so it's going to take effort to do the work. And sometimes it's going to take a lot of effort, just like it took Abraham to do his work of taking Isaac, his own son, that he waited for 25 years to come to be born. Now this same God is telling him to go sacrifice him. What an ordeal he went through. So that work was not easy. That work did not just flow from his faith. That was something he had to really think hard about and finally made the right decision. You see, that's the kind of works that we're going to have to do in order to be justified. And they're not easy. Okay. So all this talk about, well, the works are just going to flow, that's a fallacy. And the longer we live life, the more we realize that. Yes, God gives you the grace, and that gives you the impetus to even think about doing works, but you got to go out there and do it. God's not going to do it for you. Okay.